Elliot, we are in a place right now that has some of the most stunning landscapes I have ever seen in my life. What is this place, and why are we here?
We're in Timna Park, on the southern end of the Negev. Maybe we should place ourselves. We can see Jordan off to the east, the mountains of Edom, the Jordanian border down at the bottom of that slope.
Edom meaning the Edomites from the Bible.
Yes, from this area to the south. Midian, further to the south, biblical Midian.
Sure.
That valley continues to Eilat, Israel's southernmost city. Back here over the mountains, not too far away, the Egyptian border with Sinai. Remember, we're in that narrow V coming down to the bottom of the southern tip of Israel.
Near the Red Sea.
Near the Red Sea, the Gulf of Eilat, Gulf of Aqaba. And this park is in a valley, and really, aside from the beauty, and just the natural beauty of all of it, I would say the claim to fame of this place, historically, is that there's copper here, copper ore, which was discovered some 5,000 years ago, but really developed and worked by the Egyptians some 3,300 years ago, and we'll be seeing some of the mines.
Yeah, we're going to go into those mines. Yeah. And that was roughly around the period of Pharaoh from the Bible and the time of Moses.
Yes.
Where Egypt was a real power in this region.
Exactly. It was around the time, give or take a century, of the Exodus. So, yeah, Egypt, a regional power for sure. And they extend out here, and I think it's important to understand, this doesn't become Egypt. It becomes part of Egyptian influence. Gotcha. They establish a massive copper mining industry here to ship back to Egypt. Later on, a few hundred years later, Solomon will work his way down here and do the same. The Egyptians will retreat a little bit further away.
As the Davidic dynasty
rises and pushes them back.
Yeah, and Elliot, you mentioned we're in the Negev. For folks at home, so you know, that means we're in the desert. It's the Negev desert. It's hot. It's about 106 degrees Fahrenheit, but a stark beauty out here.
Yeah, Negev actually means dry. It's not just hot, but you can see.
I can see and feel why.
That's right.
Okay, the Egyptians this is a major source of revenue for them with the copper mining. Then you mentioned the rise of that Davidic dynasty. What comes next here in Timna Park?
Well, Solomon comes and continues. Now, here also, I think important for us to understand, while all this is going on, the Israelites know that there's copper down here because they've learned it. In other words, it's ancient times, but people travel, they're talking, they don't have internet, but there's communication. As the Egyptians withdraw with the defeat of the Philistines, further back, sort of across the desert, so the Solomonic kingdom pushes down into this area, and it begins to exploit the copper ore down here as well.
So this is almost the southernmost point of Solomon's kingdom?
The southernmost point of the influence of the kingdom, I would say. Okay.
So this was definitely a Solomonic sphere of influence under King Solomon. Wow. Exactly. And this stretches, as you were saying, pretty far south. We're hours from Jerusalem.
Yes, we're hours from Jerusalem and through the desert. And that's critical to understand, because to extend out here also requires a great deal of power.
Yes, and that dynasty under David and especially under Solomon grew in power and influence across this region.
Right, until the split, of course.
Yeah, of course. Well, we have so much amazing geology here and just natural formations. I see the hand of God here, the amazing beauty, Elliot. But we also have some man-made structures here, ancient man-made structures from some 3,300 years ago that we're going to take a look at right now. And we're talking Egypt a little bit here, right?
Correct.
Lead the way, my friend. So Elliot, you mentioned that there was a heavy Egyptian presence here.
Yes.
Now the Egyptians, as we know from the Bible, worshiped many pagan deities.
Yes, they did.
And this was one of their centers of worship for those workers in those copper mines that you mentioned.
That's right, for the workers and for the overseers. They may not have cared much about the workers. But yes, this was actually a combined Egyptian and Midianite temple, but primarily Egyptian. Its core was Egyptian. And the placement here possibly had to do with facing the east, having the sun rise into it. We can see late in the day, it's nicely shaded. The Egyptians had that sense. And up on the cliff above, on the face, is an engraving of the goddess Hathor, with a worshiper presenting her with a present. That was really the holy spot. In other words, they worshipped here, but they worshipped to her picture up there.
Wow. And this is about 3,300 years ago, yes, during the time of the Exodus, or near around that time.
Exactly. We're standing in a place that was being used while the Israelites were slaves in Egypt.
Wow. And it was being used by slaves here and their overseers. And you wonder if any Hebrew slaves were brought here, right?
Exactly. I was just going to say, we have no record of it, but if they had slaves, and we know that the Israelites were slaves, it's entirely possible that some of them were brought out here.
And they worked these copper mines, which we'll see in a second. Pharaoh was a nasty, nasty man.
Yes, he
and
was.
Conquered a lot of territory. So there were slaves, I assume, from all over the region, right, Africa, the Middle East, coming here.
From this area. That's why I say it with a question mark. It's a possibility. Right. There's no evidence one way or the other. Logic would say they probably didn't bring them all the way from Egypt to here. They used more local captives. Keeping in mind also, being a slave, and we know this from Scripture and the way they treated the Hebrew slaves, killing a slave was no big deal as far as they were concerned, whether it was the Egyptian beating the slave that Moses saves in the beginning of Exodus, or just working them to death.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to work someone to death, Elliot, this is the place to do it.
Absolutely.
You're in the middle of a harsh, unforgiving terrain here in the Negev desert. It gets up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Right. So if you want to work someone to death, this is the place to do it. We're sure that happened. And you know, you had this pagan worship going on here, and it's incredibly well preserved as we look at these ancient bowls. And but Pharaoh's gods failed him miserably in his confrontation with the Israelites. Thank God.
Yes, they did. And let's be serious. For millennia, this has been an abandoned place. It's only with the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel that we can look upon this place and say, you know what, they were here. Okay, so they were. Now it's ours.
And we're back.
Yes, we are.
And Elliot, as you said, this place lied dormant for about 2,000 years until the Jewish people returned. So exciting to be able to walk this land again.
Absolutely. And you know, the Timna Valley is basically a dead end. So abandoned here is in the real sense, because there are parts of it that had some caravans going through, but this is not a natural caravan route. There are other better valleys. Yeah. So abandoned for real. We're talking about nothing is going on here.
Desolate. You can hear a pin drop here. We're the sound of our voices is the only sound here for miles and miles away.
And it's paradoxically, it's only when the Jewish people return to their homeland that we can actually look at an Egyptian temple from 3,000 plus years ago and say, okay, they were here, but now we're here.
That's right. And right now we're going to go to that Egyptian-run copper mine that you mentioned when things were really buzzing here in the desert some 3,500 years ago. Not in a good way, but it's fascinating. Let's go underground, Elliot, into those mines right now. Don't move. The copper mines coming up. We are in the middle of the desert. This is Timna Park, just north of Eilat, which is the southernmost point of Israel. We're near the Red Sea. We're not that far from Egypt and Jordan. And right now we're in a very unique spot in this desert. Where are we?
We're actually sitting in a copper mine. The origins of the mines here are 5,000 years ago. These mines are only from about 3,300 years ago. And you said we're near Egypt. In those days, this was part of Egyptian influence. It wasn't Egypt proper, but the Egyptians were here. And they found copper ore. Actually, period before that, copper ore was known to be here. The Egyptians, some 3,300 years ago, which glides us into the time of David and Solomon 3,000 years ago, established a mining industry here in which, and interesting enough and not surprisingly, they understood that it would be better to do the industrial extraction of copper metal here than to bring all the ore to Egypt and do it there. In other words, what they would ship out of here was just the metal.
Yeah, they would take, okay.
Okay. And the way they did it basically was to drop shafts. This is an open one, but we can see circular shafts all around this area till they hit the vein of copper ore that they knew they would find. In other words, it wasn't a random shot. They would hit that line, which is here, and we can actually see some of the remnants of it. And then they would cut horizontal shafts like the ones that we see here to actually mine the ore straight out. They weren't blundering around here on
They were very efficient.
Efficient, they were directed. They know that they're an area of copper. As a matter of fact, you don't have to go very far. Here's some copper ore.
Everywhere around us.
It's everywhere around. And what I find particularly interesting, in addition to the mining, which, when you think about it, is an industrial machinery wonder.
Yeah, this is ancient mining.
Where they're doing it by hand.
By the way, who was doing it? Who was actually doing the mining? We know it was Egyptian directed.
Right, well, they were slaves, certainly.
Slave labor, and just so people know, it's, I think, 106 degrees Fahrenheit here today, where we are.
In the shade.
In the shade. Where luckily we have a little bit of a patch of it here in the mines.
Right, and which also tells us that they understood how to work in this kind of heat. Because, you know, because they slaves, they didn't treat them well and that sort of thing. But you can't have your slave population dying off on you.
I mean, there's the desert, and then there's the desert. Right. This is the desert where we are right now.
We're really in the middle of it.
Yeah.
From a purely human history point of view, we have this error in thought in which we think that we behave as if the ancients were primitive. And I know you've probably had it in conversations. I know that I have people who say that, you know, religion is the result of superstition of primitive peoples, and they're trying to explain a world that they don't understand and that sort of thing. Well, I challenge someone to explain to me how over 3,000 years ago, people understood and knew that if you heat this up to a high enough temperature, you will get copper metal out of it. And then how do you actually go about raising a temperature to that level in a furnace in order to do it? And to separate the metal, purify it, and they actually ship the copper metal ingots from here, leaving the slag, the junk behind.
Wow. Talk about a smart business mind.
That's right.
Among the Egyptians, and industrial.
Yeah. So, of course, this is a major economic resource center for them. Copper is important for them, not just today pennies, right? But it's part of their metal work. It's part of how they make weapons. They're making bronze out of it. They already know enough metallurgy. They're not further on yet, but they've moved from sticks and stones to using metal in a very sophisticated way. And once again, we're talking about 3,500 years ago.
Yeah, so this was around the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, maybe after that, maybe
right.
Moses.
Right. Yeah, in that interregnum.
Yeah. When did the party end for the Egyptians here in Timna and in these copper mines?
Well, Egypt goes into a bit of a recessional decline, if you will. And of course, it matches with the rise of David. Remember that the Philistines are Egyptian proxy front line. They're defeated by Saul ultimately, well, by David ultimately. They defeated Saul. The defeat of the Philistines is part of a drive pushing the Egyptians back. Now the Jews, who are not called Jews yet, but for our purposes,
the Israelites.
They're past Israelites, the Davidic dynasty, the tribes, don't have an interest in conquering Egypt. They're not going back there. So the desert, the Negev and Sinai, become a sort of buffer zone between them. And Solomon comes down here because he starts using this area for the same reason the Egyptians did. And we talk about Solomon's mines here, and Solomon's name appears. And he uses the port of what we call today Eilat to ship out through the Indian Ocean. And here again, interestingly enough, we think that global trade is a mid 15th, 16th century phenomenon. No. It goes back to 2,000 and more years, 3,000 years.
Yeah, so there's an amazing biblical history here. It's a geological wonder, Timna Park. Yes. It's just stunning, the landscape here. And by the way, that breeze that just went past was pretty nice.
It was.
It is the Gospel of Matthew that gives us the most detailed account of the birth of Jesus. And among others, it records 3 wise men coming from the east to adorn the newborn. And upon seeing him and his mother, they present unique gifts: gold, myrrh, and frankincense. Who could be those people? As an archaeologist studying this region for many years, the region of the Holy Land and its neighboring cultures, I am of the opinion that it could only be referring to one group of people: the Nabateans. The Nabateans were a Semitic group of people who in the time of Jesus had a special economical niche of transporting goods from the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as Eastern Africa, and even goods from India across the desert and up to the Eastern Mediterranean at the port of Gaza. No one else knew how to carry the loads through this harsh environment. Only the Nabateans had the knowledge of hidden water reservoirs that could, in a way, refuel their camels and so manage this journey. The goods were of various types, but it is the myrrh, the frankincense, which would be burnt on incense burners like these and produce a very special and pleasant odor that was very popular for both domestic use and rituals. And the last 5 days of the journey would be through the southern area of the Holy Land, through the Negev. This site, Ofdat, was one of them. Ofdat, named after a Nabatean king, would be a major rest place after crossing the Arava, the Ramon crater, and before completing the last stage of the journey, reaching Gaza, where the reward will finally be given to them in a lot of cash. Back then, gold. Ofdat started as a caravanserai in the middle of the Negev, halfway between the Ramon crater and the spring of Ofdat. This hilltop originally was used by the Nabateans probably for sacrificial activities. This slab of stone seemed to have been used for rituals. The grooves leading into a small basin were perhaps to enable the slaughter of small animals by the Nabateans to thank their gods, Dushara and El-Uza, for achieving this long journey, at least up to this point. And behind me, the columns, the Nabatean capitals, were all probably part of a Nabatean cultic center. Ofdat continued to be inhabited also in Roman and Byzantine times, and in fact in the Byzantine Christian periods, it developed into a small town with 2 churches. Let's take a look at one of them. This basilica-shaped church, added in the citadel of Ofdat in Byzantine times, demonstrates the impact of Christianity even in the limits of the Roman Empire in the heart of the desert. And yet, although we have a good document of the city center, the residential area of Ofdat, which reflects the daily life here in ancient times, is still waiting to be uncovered by a proper large-scale excavation. Who knows what might be hiding in those caves? Maybe even treasures left by the Nabateans. Treasures of myrrh, of frankincense, of gold. Might be waiting here to be uncovered, reflecting on this legendary wealth of the Nabateans.